Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute.
It's kind of cool. We can see participants entering. You guys see that? Welcome as you come in. We're going to wait a few minutes before we start just to give people time to enter. If you haven't had a chance, under Files Resources, we have a worksheet that we're going to be at least referencing. We won't have tons of time to fill it out with you, but it would be a good reference if you have a moment to take a look at that resource. Looks like we're slowing down on people entering, so I think we'll start doing a couple of the beginning slides just to get through our organization. Katie is going to be switching this slide, so if you hear Kate and I say, please, next slide, you will know why. So please, next slide. So because this is probably some of your first, if you weren't able to see the first session, and you know we love in our PBIS practices to talk through expectations and to have expectations, we're just gonna, for 2 seconds, go through them. You will find that as you go through the conference, people will probably just say, here are your expectations, and zip through. But we'll go through responsible, respectful, and safe. For the overall event, that you have a shared action plan. I'm sure that's been shared with you before, and that you complete evaluations. You will notice that there'll be so many prompts to do evaluations throughout this entire conference. We love our data, so please fill it out at the end. Limit distractions and follow up on your assigned action. Take movement breaks and be aware of your stress level. We were just talking, we can't tell who's here, we can't see. If you guys need to take a break, go ahead and do it. We will not know. You will know if we take a break, so we will try to limit our breaks. The chat table, if you haven't found it already, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are already posting, please post on topic comments, and we'll talk about polls in a minute. Use inclusive language and engage in productive dialogue. And we will, on our end, monitor and remove any inappropriate comments. And then finally, for polls, if you haven't seen the polls, please add your bigger questions to that, which will let Karen kind of cover and monitor a little bit easier and bring them in at the end. Use sincere phrasing, complete additional polls when prompted. Please do, because we're trying to make it a little bit engaged considering that this is all virtual. And ask solution-oriented questions. And we will try our best to have the final 15 minutes be for questions. Next slide. You obviously have found this. But if you are getting confused, your agenda on that homepage will show which sessions you are in, and then you click in and you will be joining the session. Next slide. this is how it looks as you're looking at it, but you can see where the chats, the polls, the people, and then the files, and the files are where we have the resources. Next slide. Obviously chat, please use it just as a chat session. We can't see the chats within our Zoom, so all communication is going to be through that Pathable. And please, your bigger questions, please put in the polls. Next slide. If you navigate away from the page, you need to check your email for a minute. You might get dumped out of this. Just come back in. You're going to have to then go to the agenda and then come back in through it. And if we get dumped, internet problems, etc., we'll be doing the same thing. So just come back and re-enter, and we welcome you again. Next slide. Support is available, help desk, and then we also have an incredible TA helper who is helping to troubleshoot and might already be doing so if there are any tech problems. Next slide. And finally, when you're working in your team, this is going to be a slide that we're showing in all the presentations that think about how this session will help with your overall priorities, what team would oversee this work, what should we stop doing to make room for this work so we're not always adding more to our plates, and how will we assess whether it's implemented well and working. Next slide. All right, so the learning objectives. So I'm sure right now you're all aware that we are talking about IEPs for students with behavioral challenges. We did have a pre-question for someone who is asking about autism specific. And what we're hoping is this will apply for all students in special education that would have some behavior issues and would include students with autism. Participants will be introduced to some best practices for developing IEPs, and we alerted you to that step-by-step worksheet, which we're hoping you can use afterwards as something to help you with IEP development. We'll provide examples that are measurable, observable, and relevant, and you'll have the opportunity to practice, although again, a little hard in a non-workshop presentation setting to do lots of practicing. And then we'll also embed ways to collaborate with families throughout the process. Next slide. All right, so just to introduce myself, we've done our 5 minutes of waiting for people to join. My name is Laura Kern. I work at University of South Florida, and a lot of the work I do is for the PBIS TA Center, which is sponsoring this forum. I'm very much interested in special education, and especially with behavior. I got into special education. I was a lawyer for a bunch of years, but my son was diagnosed with first autism, then ADHD and anxiety, and that brought me into learning more about special ed and lots of classes. And then I have a PhD and entered into the PBIS world, as I thought that was a really great way to help support my son in special education and make sure that he's more included within the school. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen, our wonderful content facilitator, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody. I am Karen Robbie. I am a research associate at University of Connecticut and a longtime general educator, and just completed my doctoral degree this summer from the University of Maine with a focus in classroom management practices and supports. Really excited to be here, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Katie Meyer.
Hello and welcome everybody. I have the pleasure of working with Karen at the University of Connecticut. And prior to that, I worked for a nonprofit organization and provided a lot of support for classrooms, individuals, students and teachers and families, for students who had behavioral challenges, also providing more at the sort of classroom or systems level support to schools with implementing effective classroom management practices or PBIS at tier 1, and then across sort of the tiers all the way up to tier 3. And I am going to pass it over to Kate to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kate Dooley. I'm an assistant professor at the University of St. Joseph's in Connecticut. I work with a lot of pre-service and in-service teachers who are just getting their certification in special education. And prior to that, I was a special education teacher in an alternative high school, middle school, high school for students who are struggling with behavior. So I wrote loads and loads of IEPs for kiddos in behavior. And I think that leads us to the next slide.
Let's check in for 1 second.
Oh,
Karen,
thanks, Laura.
who's joining us, and have they taken the poll on their position, just so we get an idea of who's in the participants?
Yeah, so I'm seeing that we have people from all over the United States that are here, and welcome to all of them. And we have a couple of people I've also seen from Canada. When we look at their roles, we've got 30% of the people joining us that are special ed teachers. And we've got, let's see, schools, 10% that are school psychologists, another 15% is behavior specialists. And then there's a mix of some general ed teachers, school counselors, and administrators, and then a large chunk of people that are identifying as other. So welcome to everybody. And if you're interested, you can put it in chat as to what your other role might be.
Thanks, Karen. Welcome, everybody. And now back to Kate.
So why are we so focused on just developing really high quality IEPs for kiddos who are struggling with behavior? Is because I think a lot of the times, especially in my experience as a young undergrad learning how to work with students who are struggling with behavior, we kind of skip the piece about how do you write an IEP for a student struggling with behavior? How do you write their present levels of performance? How do you write meaningful goals and objectives that we can actually measure progress? So for example, I'd like to give this, it's sort of a modification of a real life scenario from my teaching days, as an example of a present levels of performance that I've seen, which was that Laura struggles to make friends. She often plays by herself in the playground, and Laura's parents report she's not invited to birthday parties or play dates with her classmates, which often results in a goal of Laura will make friends in 85% of occasions. While it's really very important that Laura makes friends, sorry, Laura didn't want to present her own IEP goal, but why is it important that we think about behavior goals? And what I want you all to think about is what might be some of the problems, except that you're not here, but you think about it while you're there. What might be some of the problems with this broad goal in terms of Laura making friends on 85% of occasions? And so as we go through, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but just think about that. And then we'll work on narrowing Laura's skill set down a little bit more as we go through the presentation. Next slide. So we're going to start at the very beginning of the model of special education, from child find all the way through to student evaluations, student services, and placement, but we'll start with that with Laura. Next slide. Are you ready?
All right. So when I got into special ed, I mentioned that I came in really from a parent perspective, and some of the people that I'd be talking to were other parents, and they'd be like, wow, you got a kid with autism. Well, you have to move to this town and go to this school because they have the best autism program in the state. And I'd be like, well, first of all, I don't think I want to move. But like, I also was like, well, why is there an autism program? Like, I'm a lawyer, like, isn't it individualized education? So one of the things that I learned was this model of special education, which we're gonna, have the identification, our evaluation, and our eligibility. That's the initial getting kids into special education. But we also want to think about our ongoing evaluation as we go through special ed that leads to an IEP development. And that's really where we're going to be focusing our talk today, is on that development. And then after that, then we talked about placement. So just keep that in mind, that this is kind of the model of what we're thinking about where we see IEP development. Is that evaluation, the IEP development, and then you think about where that kid is going to be receiving special ed. Next slide. And the other thing we want you to think about is, we were debating whether or not to put one of the pyramids, right? Because it's PBIS, so we always have to have the pyramid. But what we were afraid of is that you come away thinking that like special ed is tier 3. It's individualized. It's always that top of the pyramid. And kids can be in many different areas in that pyramid. So a kid with special education can be receiving universal tier 1 practices. They can have maybe some social work that's going on in small settings that might not be part of the IEP, and they might be receiving individualized interventions that don't qualify for special ed. And then they also can be receiving the specialized instructions. The other thing to think about is that the student has influenced by so many contextual variables, the non-classroom, what's happening in recess, what's happening in other areas, the classroom, then what's happening with themselves, and then also the family. We have a raised hand. Karen, did you add that? That's all right. I was going to say, Sarah, if you have, Sarah Rogers, if you have a question, type it in the chat, and then that will get to us. All right, next slide, please. So how do we work together across these contexts, and how do we achieve our goals? Next slide. So we're not going to go in great detail through this, but I just wanted to alert you to this idea of family engagement, this dual capacity building framework, which the Department of Education has put out. And if you want to know more, please feel free to Google and find the more resources on this. But the reason why we included this slide is we want you to realize that when we're talking about working with families, it's not just the practices that we've invited them to an IEP meeting. We send home newsletters. We have our practices in place, but that we also think about the contextual considerations that families bring in, and that they really should be included more in the process, not just at that IEP meeting, in order to get our really good outcomes. We really want to look at family partnerships, not just family practices. Next slide. And we also wanted to alert you to there's a broad definition within IDA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is really where we're getting special education. And for those Canadian participants, this would be an American law, but it's really does define parent, but it does it broadly. So we talk about natural adoptive foster parents, we talk about guardians, we talk about individuals that are legally responsible, and then surrogate parents. So think about that, not just, you know, the stereotypical mom, dad, but who is helping with our kids, and think about that concept of family, not just the typical one when we talk about family involvement. Next slide. And then finally, what do parents bring to the table throughout the process? So not just in the feedback, not just at the IEP meeting, but where are they coming in to provide information? They can share unique characteristics of their kid. They can talk about strengths and weaknesses that you might not be aware of because it's only happening in home. They can talk about the same behaviors that are happening in home might look different than what's happening in school, or they might not even be behaviors at home. So maybe you can learn from home what to do in school settings. You can learn about academic social history. Parents often are working with outside providers who might have additional assessments that might be shared with the IEP team. And then also, where are they using some of these skills? Are they in Scouts? Are they in church? Where do they need to have these behaviors that are important in schools also be happening in their community? Finally, it helps to provide insight on what is appropriate. Next slide. And what is appropriate is so important for IDA and special ed, because it really gets to the heart of the pillar of IDA, which is that FAPE, free appropriate public education. And there are things that we can do as special educators to help make it appropriate. We can have assessment, which includes that family and really thinks comprehensively about the individual needs. We can document that in the PLOP, or PLAP as it's now called, and we're going to be talking about that in the slides to follow. And we can make sure that we have appropriate IEP goals. Next slide. And just for those who haven't been in special ed for a while in the law, FAPE, just remember, is that free, appropriate public education. And the thing about the appropriate is that it shifted a little bit with the Andrew decision in 2017, where we reaffirmed Rowley. So we need to meet the procedural requirements. We need to make sure that we do things the right way, but we also now have to think about progress that is appropriate. So appropriate now talks about progress. And when we think about progress, we should have that ding, 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 ding. That gets into assessment and data and making sure that kids are doing well. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to thinking about appropriate social and behavioral goals with Katie.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you for providing that great foundation to start our conversation. If you are following along in the Files tab, you can download the worksheet, and we're going to start now kind of walking through those different items on the worksheet, starting with how do we identify the appropriate skills to teach? How do we identify appropriate social and behavioral goals? And this is the first step really in the process that we're going to walk through. And there are two critical kind of pieces to this. First, thinking about what are critical and appropriate behavior skills to teach. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to determine that. And second, what is the student's present levels of performance? So we want to be able to answer these two questions. And doing so will provide us with a blueprint on what skills we want to teach. I think it's important to keep in mind as we start to identify skills, just recognizing that social, emotional, and behavioral skills, we know are learned behaviors, right? These are things that we learn to do through our environment, through the interactions that we have with other people, from learning how to ask to join in with a group of peers, to how to solve disagreements, to how to enter the classroom appropriately, to how to work in small groups. All of these kinds of skills are highly contextual. They involve interactions. And because they are learned, they are also skills that we can identify and teach. We wanted to provide some examples and non-examples. In my role as a consultant, I worked with, again, a lot of students and individual teachers on this process of assessing and identifying what is the targeted skill that we want to try to work on and to teach. And you can see in the non-examples, we want to be specific about what that skill looks like. And non-examples tend to be more general. And then the specific examples are something that is observable, that's measurable, and that we can break down into smaller pieces and teach those individual components. And this really starts with having a conversation with families and parents and students, and talking about, what are the skills that will result in socially significant behavior change, and what do each of those stakeholders view as socially significant? Because what we view as socially significant in the classroom or in the school may not necessarily translate to something that's very important for families and students. So answering these two questions, what's socially significant, and then what's important to students and their family across the various contexts that the student is in, helps to hone in on what some of those skills may look like. And the answers, again, may look a little bit different. They may focus on, improved communication, on safety a lot of times, or improved quality of life. A lot of times these skills will address barriers that interfere with learning in the classroom, but also oftentimes in other contexts. And they may increase independence, although that may not be something that is important to all families or across all contexts. So again, important to have those conversations and get feedback from families and students on what they view as important and significant. So if you can look at the next poll, and we'd love to hear from you in your experience. What do you tend to see in terms of the level of family and student involvement in developing these skills? And as you respond, I will move on to the next one, and then we'll check in on your answers. So this process involves assessment, both formal and informal. And we're going to focus, we could spend the whole 75 minutes just talking about these assessment pieces, but we won't. We're going to focus a little bit on the rating scales and the direct observation piece. Again, there are pros and cons for each of these methods of assessment, which is why the assessment results are most valid and powerful and useful if a combination of these are used. So rating scales in combination with direct observation and structured interviews and record review gives a nice perspective from multiple angles on, what is the student's current level of performance and what skills, are they maybe having deficits in. The records reviews and the structured interviews are also often conducted as part of a larger assessment or FBA process. So again, we're not going to get into that kind of detail in this presentation, but something that you probably have seen a lot of. If you're interested in looking for some evidence-based rating scales, here are some examples. This is not an extensive list, but these are probably ones that you are familiar with and have possibly seen before. And again, each of these has some pros and cons associated with them. And I just want to check in with Karen on the results from the poll a moment ago.
Sure, thanks, Katie. So it looks like we've got about 41% of people saying that family and student input are solicited during the IEP meeting, and about 28% that family and student are present at the IEP meetings, with 24% recognizing that there is a system for ongoing communication regarding identifying goals and measuring progress. And about 7% are saying that family and students participate in the process of identifying goals.
Great, thank you. And I think that's pretty consistent with what I've experienced too, is that it's most common for families and students to have an opportunity to provide some input during the IEP meeting, which is important. But if you think about, that meeting time is short, there's not a lot of time to prepare or think or, contemplate the feedback that you're about to give as a parent or a student in that meeting necessarily. And so having an ongoing process and being part of the PBIS framework, we know that having systems to support those kinds of practices and to support stakeholder involvement and communication are really critical. So, just challenge you to think beyond what, including input during the meeting, but what systems could we put in place to facilitate communication and input from families in a more ongoing manner. And we'll be talking about these as we go today. So as we're looking at some of these assessment features, we talked a little bit about some of those rating scales that are available. Direct observations, again, are something that you're probably very familiar with and used to doing. These can be done, along a continuum from very formal kinds of direct observations and data collection to, less formal. But ideally, the information that is gathered during these observations gives us a sense of what the actual behavior looks like in the context. So in the school context, in the home context, in the community. And looking specifically at what are the contextual indicators, what's the setting or routine that we tend to see challenging behavior occur in, who is or isn't around, are there maybe times of the day when the student does perform this particular skill, because sometimes we'll notice that the student does have this skill in their repertoire sometimes, but not always. And then also, what does that behavior of concern look like? How do we want to define it in terms of duration, intensity, variability, and thinking about our ABCs of antecedent, what happens immediately before that tends to trigger the behavior, the observable and measurable behavior itself, and then what tends to follow immediately after the behavior that likely reinforces the behavior and makes it more likely to happen again in the future. What are some of those environmental factors, and how do changes in those environmental factors affect the occurrence or non-occurrence of the behavior? So we're going to go back to our initial example and look at some more information about Laura. So we know that she's in 2nd grade. She has average receptive and expressive verbal skills. So that's important information to consider. We know that she has some of those skills in place already. And when we think about the behavior that's of most concern to the school, the family, and the student, we have identified that Laura often plays and completes classroom assignments independently. So she's tending to do this on her own. When she's asked to work with peers, she leaves the room and puts her head down. And this makes it, really difficult for her to participate in small group and large group activities and collaborative projects, which is important in 2nd grade, but as we know, is likely to become more and more important socializing as she gets older. So in addition, we also find out that, and maybe this is through direct observation, that Laura often sits and interacts with adults during lunch and recess, so that we know that she has many of these skills and is able to exhibit them with adults, but she's not exhibiting them with peers. So gathering that information from the family and the student, from the school, and from annual progress reports helps to kind of funnel down and provide this information on Laura's present levels of performance, or your students' present levels of performance. And I will hand it over to Kate to talk more about present levels of performance.
Thank you, Katie. So when we think about present levels of performance, we always want to ground it in describing what the effect of that student's disability has on their ability to participate in the general ed curriculum. So we're always thinking about going back and thinking about what's going on in the general education curriculum, as well as what is specifically going on with that student. We're going to include, again, in general, present levels of performance, or PLAPs. We call them PLOPs in Connecticut. What we're going to include academic and non-academic areas for students based on where the areas of suspected disability are, or the areas of disability. We always want to make sure that what we're thinking about and putting in the present levels of performance is data-based, so that it's objective, it's observable, it's measurable. And that when we describe what's going on with this kiddo, that the scores are either pretty self-explanatory, or that we're explaining those scores, because we want our present levels of performance to be accessible to all folks reading it, including special educators, families, and other folks in the team, such as general education teachers. They're written in all areas addressed by special education, and then linked to every other area in the IEP. So if you have an area of concern or need for a student in a present levels of performance, there needs to be corresponding goals and objectives, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And when we think about behavior, we really need a quantitative, clear understanding of what the student's baseline level of performance is, and then in relation to their peers, because again, we're always going back to look to see how is this impacting the student's ability to progress in the general ed curriculum. And this serves as the foundation of the rest of the IEP. Slide. So when we go back and narrow this down to just behavior, there are a couple of ways we want to think about what types of behaviors we might be including in a student's present levels of performance. So what do they look like? We often include what we call functional areas. So that might be a student's adaptive living skills, community participation, daily living skills. And how we look at those skills are typically done through a task analysis. So what small skills build up for that student to be able to perform that behavior proficiently? We want to look at, does the student have some of those skills mastered, or are none of those skills mastered? And oftentimes we even look at what level of prompts do we need to provide for that student to be able to perform that skill, and how close are they to performing it independently. Then we might also look at students who we talk about behavior problems. And in a present levels of performance, if students are struggling with behavior, we want to make sure it's really clear in the present levels of performance that we know what those baseline rates of that problem behavior look like. How often do they happen? When do they happen? What is the duration of the problem behavior? We want to include what is the function? What is reinforcing that problem behavior over time? And then we'll also look at, and if any of you have ever done a competing pathways, which is one of my favorite things to draw out when I'm trying to figure out what's going on with a kiddo, what do we want the student to do instead of the problem behavior? So we're focused on what is going on with our kiddo now, but where do we want them to be? What are some replacement behaviors that might meet the same function as the problem behavior? Or what do we want that student to do over the long run? What is the desired classroom behavior for students? Then the next piece, always relating back into the general education curriculum, why is that behavior critical for that student to make progress in the general education curriculum? Why is the lack of certain behaviors and the use of some problem behaviors for kids preventing them from making progress in school? Slide. So when we think about functional behaviors, so we talked about those places where we're doing a task analysis and looking at maybe daily living skills. Think about when and where does that student need to perform those behaviors? Are there specific times of the day? Are there specific locations? Is it with specific folks? What skills can the student perform? Are they currently performing now within those discrete behaviors? And what skills is the student not performing? Link this back not only to school, you want to know, is the student doing these behaviors, engaging in them in school, at home, as well as the community. So we're going to look across the board. Where is the student performing the skills or not performing the skills? When we think about students struggling with behavior problems, we also want to think about when and where is that behavior occurring? Are there more problematic times during the day? Are there more problematic settings during the day? Or are there more problematic locations? We often have students who are struggling with more problematic behaviors during less structured situations, such as transitions, hallways, recess, locker rooms, any place where things are less supervised and less structured. Additionally, we want to think about that behavior itself. How frequently is it occurring? Is it occurring sometimes? Is it occurring fairly frequently through the day? Is actually that behavior in itself not necessarily a problem behavior, but it's the frequency of which that behavior occurs. So it might be that kiddo that's participating 20 times in a 5-minute period. Or is it the problem that this behavior is occurring for longer durations of time? Then we'll go and think about, okay, how can we teach students replacement behaviors that meet the same function or allow the student to be able to more appropriately get their needs met as a problem behavior? Or think about what is the desired behavior. The reason we want to do this is as we get into students' goals and objectives, we really want our goals and objectives to be focused on what we want our students to do versus what we don't want them to do. So our big piece will always be, where do we want students to be at the end of the year? What skills should they be performing, whether it's functional or a behavior problem? But we'll get into that more later. Slide. Thank you. So again, as I just said, we're really focused on what we want students to do. So if the if it's a functional behavior, they're typically positively stated anyway, because we've done a task analysis to determine what skills we need students to have. And again, if it's a problem behavior, we want to spend a lot of time thinking about where do we want that student to be, what types of behavior are we hoping that they'll be able to perform by the end of the year for their annual reviews. So again, we'll talk about what does it look like and making sure that all those behaviors that we're describing are observable and measurable. And then we want to know when and where is that student expected to perform that behavior. Then a really important question is the student performing the behavior at all? Do we have to start at the beginning? Do we have to start with teaching that behavior directly, teaching that student how to perform that behavior, versus is the student performing the behavior somewhere? We know they have that skill, but we have to teach them how to maintain it or generalize that skill as well. Slide. So for Laura, we said when she's asked to work with her peers or participate in small group activities, she either elopes or puts her head down. So when we think about this, the problem behavior itself, we know when and where it's occurring during small or large group activities, lunch or physical education, those times throughout the day where she's asked to participate or interact with her peers. But then we have to think about this in more detail. We want to know, how often is this happening? How big of a problem is it throughout the day? So in the case of Laura, we said she eloped 3 times to the classroom and she's out for 45 minutes. Now we have a better picture, and our present levels of performance becomes a little clearer, that if she's out 3 times a day for 45 minutes, or she's putting her head on her desk for 10 minutes, she's missing an awful lot of instruction, and she's also missing an awful lot of time interacting with her peers. So then once we have a really good, clear idea of what's going on with our student, then we want to think about, what is the expected behavior for Laura? Rather than having Laura walk out of the classroom or put her head down, we might teach her how to ask for a break, so it gives her that time away from her peers. She's still in the instructional setting, but we'll always think about, how do we teach her the desired behavior over time? So we want Laura to interact with her peers. So that we'll think about too within her present levels of performance, as well as thinking about goals and objectives in the future. Slide. So what we did next was we operationally defined the behavior that Laura is engaging into really clearly, and thought about, what are the discrete skills that we can teach Laura, where we'll focus on our goals throughout the year. Where is she now? So we said the peer interactions piece, which we have to define really clearly, means that Laura is making peer greetings in the morning or in the afternoon, that she's responding to peer questions, that she contributes to group discussions. So we're hitting in those times where she's asked to collaborate with peers, that she is collaborating with peers on assignments, and she's sitting with peers, because we said that she sits with adults during lunch, and that she plays mutually enjoyed games with peers at recess. This is where we would love to see Laura. Some of the non-examples that might be a little bit confusing during the day, because we're trying to figure out who she's interacting with. We know she's already interacting with teachers and she's responding to teachers. A non-example of what a peer interaction would be is that she's completing the work, but she's doing it independently. What we really want Laura to be doing is working with that group. And that she sits with peers during groups assignments, but remains silent or puts her head down. Again, we want Laura to contribute. And that at lunch, she's sitting with staff rather than peers, and she's standing with her teachers during recess. So this hits at those discrete skills that we really want to focus in on. And then we'll pick one for an example for this presentation, but you would work with each of these pieces to try to get Laura to the point where she's interacting more with her peers throughout the day. Slide. So again, just to give us back to our example, that Laura was a 2nd grade student, she's average verbal skills and expressive and receptive. And so that we know that now we're working on trying to help her interact with her peers more, but she also is able at the same time to interact fairly well with the adults in the scenarios. Slide. So back to where we've been talking about, we want to think about the behavior that we're working on. Is it an acquisition? Is it a skill that the student doesn't know how to do yet? Or is it a performance issue? That you've seen the student perform the skill in different places, but they're not performing it either to the frequency that you need them to perform it with. They may not be maintaining it over time, or they're not performing the skill within different staff, different settings, different contexts, so they're not generalizing it. So we want to hit all of these pieces and figure out where our kiddo is, so that we can design services to really support them. And as we go along, you may find that there's a combination of both that you need to do. So you may have to look at, where are we starting from with acquisition for certain skills? How is the student's performance? And we may be working on behavior reduction strategies all at the same time. Slide. So we have some kind of examples for you to look at. So if we're thinking about skill acquisition for students, the examples of how we would just start about thinking of going about approaching these is really, what are those specific skills, being specific and observable and measurable. In academics, we do a really good job of understanding if a student's struggling to read. They may be learning how to blend letter sounds. So it may be that learning piece, they're right at the beginning. But we also have kiddos, if they're struggling with identifying emotions in different students, that they have to learn to do that first. So we have to start there, and we have to teach them the skills. Versus when we think about enhancing skill performance, it may be things that students are already doing, but we need them to generalize it or maintain it or use it across subjects. So for the academic, we talked about main ideas. Maybe the student's able to do it in certain text or types of text, but they need to generalize it across different places. Or maybe the student says please and thank you, which I think we all have those kiddos who say please and thank you sometimes, but we want them to use it consistently in the places where we would expect them to use those behaviors. Slide. Also, the other piece is there may be competing or interfering problem behaviors with that student. So we may have a target behavior that we're working on. So in academics, we have a target behavior that we're working on helping that student complete a math worksheet, but they get fairly frustrated. So we may be working on decreasing that frustration piece so that they can better perform in the math worksheet. Or it may be students struggling with conflict resolution skills, but first we have to step back and teach them how to take a deep breath. And then the last piece is thinking about generalization. I think we get so excited when students maintain behaviors, we forget to check, are they doing this in other places? And this is that parent, home, community piece. So if we've taught students to check their spelling, we want them to do that at home when they're doing their homework. We want them to do it at home when their parents or family asks them to write a list. And in terms of behavior, it's the same piece. When we work really hard to teach a student a skill in special education services that help support math and science, that they're actually pulling those skills within those environments as well. And thank you. So the next piece for you folks is to think about selecting one skill if you were thinking about jotting this down. So we focused on peer greetings for Laura. We noticed that she does actually have the skill. She's able to greet her teachers and teacher assistants every morning appropriately. She's not greeting her peers. So really what we're working on is a frequency problem because she's not greeting them at all during the week. We're not worried about maintenance quite yet, but we will be quite soon because the behavior's not present with peers. And in terms of generalization, we really actually are thinking about her generalizing a skill she's using with adults to using that skill with kids. We have a question, so I just wanted to quickly. So the question is, can we establish the classroom expected behaviors and teach our students about expected behaviors based on the school values even before the behavior occurs? Yes, always. We're always thinking about teaching expected behaviors to all students and teaching them before the behavior occurs as well. So those are usually our proactive strategies. Slide. Katie, can you hear me?
I haven't presented this one yet. Sorry. I already moved ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I just did. Oh, no, well, okay, we've done this 1,000 times. We'll slide that over because we talked about Laura already. Once we have really strong present levels of performance of students, so we have a really clear picture about what's going on with that behavior, as well as what's going on with other behaviors that we might want to teach students, then we'll start focusing on developing meaningful goals. Next slide. Thank you, Katie. So far we've gone through identifying skills to teach. So we talked about what's a critical and appropriate. We talked about students' present levels of performance, but what is a meaningful and achievable goal? Slide. So IEP goals, they're so important. We want to think about goals that are designed to meet the student's needs resulting from their disability. These goals should allow that kiddo to be able to participate in the general education curriculum. Because if we know in our present levels of performance, we talked about the impact of the behavior and the impact of the disability on the general education curriculum. We want our goals to match that and help our kiddos participate in the gen ed curriculum and to meet other needs. IEP goals serve two purposes. They let us know if our services are appropriate for students. We're going to monitor students' progress over time, but we're also going to think about if students are meeting goals too quickly. Are they struggling to meet goals? So where is that student performing over time? But then again, how are our services? Are they appropriate for students? Are we providing enough services for students? Are we setting goals to be too easy for that student to meet, that we need to set them to be more challenging so that we can help get that kiddo in the general education curriculum more? So again, the purpose is, are our services appropriate and monitoring our students' progress? Slide. This is a funny one. So in IDEA, all students receiving special education services get goals, those annual goals once a year. And according to federal law, students have short-term objectives if they're receiving alternative assessments. Some states up the ante, like Connecticut, so all students in Connecticut get short-term objectives and annual goals. So I just wanted to parse that out for some of you folks, because we'll talk about objectives, but you may be in a state that only requires goals, or you may be in a state that requires goals and objectives for all kids at all times. Slide. So the IEP has to contain a statement about how we're measuring progress towards these goals for students. And our goals and objectives subsequently need to be linked to some sort of assessment. So I should be able to read a student's goal and objective, and I should know how, or have an idea of how they're going to measure that student's progress over time. But when we write our goals and objectives, it's critical to make sure that the goals and objectives are able to be measured. Slide. So take a minute and think about this, and as I go through each of these, but I want you to think about what percentage of goals do you see that include all of these components. So the learner is the student that we're focused on. And when you answer the next piece, the critical behavior, think about how many of them are written in observable and measurable ways. What is the critical behavior we want to teach our kiddo, that we want them to engage in by the time that they've met this goal or objective? What are the conditions? And so the conditions can be the context around that behavior itself. Are we providing the student prompts? Are we interested in just specific context for the students to perform the behavior? Such if we went back to Laura, we're interested in when she's interacting with peers during maybe small group instruction. Or are we interested in how students are performing in recess? Are we interested in how students are performing in different places? And then how do we know? What's our criteria? How do we know that that student has actually met that conditions, the behavior as well? How do we know the students has met the goal? So think about, again, how that works. Then our goal should be structured pretty clearly. In the beginning, we'll talk about the context and the conditions of the behavior. So that might include level of prompts. It might include where that behavior is going to occur. It should have our student's name, a specific and observable, measurable behavior that we can clearly see. If I were to describe that behavior, if somebody who'd never seen the student before walked into the building could see it and know what it was. And then how do we know that student has met that objective? And that criteria piece is that assessment. So you should be able to think about how they would assess that goal and objective. Slide. So here's an example. And again, for our next poll, and then I guess I'll catch up with you after this to see how folks answered. But in your experience, which component of a goal and objective, now that we've talked about them, is most likely to be excluded or forgotten? So again, so if we talked about Kate, which is now me, and I was struggling to identify my feelings and to take 3 deep breaths before responding to a teacher when I've been asked to do a non-preferred task, I would be the learner. My observable, measurable behavior is that 3 slow breaths and then rating my emotions on a 5-point scale before someone asks me to do a non-preferred task, which is very observable at that point. And I may need some verbal prompts at the beginning because it's a new skill that I'm learning how to do. So the teacher may verbally prompt me to take 3 steps, 3 deep breaths, and fill out my 5-point scale. And I need to be able to do this across 4 to 5 sampled opportunities of given non-preferred tasks during the day across 3 separate trials. This would then translate into, with verbal prompts, Kate will take 3 slow breaths and identify her feelings in a 5-point scale before responding to teachers when she's asked to do non-preferred task in 4 out of 5 sampled opportunities across 3 trials. So this is a really clear, specific, observable, measurable goal that I could definitely see how folks would determine whether or not I met that criteria. So for the first poll, Karen, do we have answers yet?
We do.
Oh,
So
good.
we've got lots of answers. So the first poll is, what percentage of goals do you see that include all 4 components? And of our participants, 43% say at least 75% of their goals include all 4. 25% say less than 50% of their goals include all 4. And 17% say over 95%. And 13% say at least 50%. So I think overall, it looks like we've got a pretty good rate percentage of goals, including many of those 4 components.
And then do we know which component's most likely to be excluded yet?
Yes. So the most likely one to be excluded is critical behavior written in observable, measurable terms. And that's at 50% of people are saying that. With 0% saying that the learner is likely to be.
And that is what I expected. The learner should be there at least. So that's the piece. So sometimes we have these critical behaviors, but they're not written in observable and measurable terms, which can be really challenging. So that's one thing to think about as we go through this, that I hope a big takeaway is, how do I get Laura, who wants to make friends, which is really important, but how do we get that into what is that? What are the critical skills she needs to get there in observable and measurable terms? Can you switch the slides, Katie, please? So these are just, again, some more examples. So I think that this hits exactly what you folks are saying that you don't see. So our non-examples, again, are not specific enough. So we want to know, again, if I were thinking about Katie raising her hand during class, there's always this pull of using the 85. It's a great number. It always goes into goals and objectives. Resist that and think about what makes sense for Katie to raise her class. So we may want to happen during whole group instruction. By the end of the year, we're hoping no prompts are needed. We want Katie to do it given whole group instruction, that she'll raise her hand before speaking on 90% of occasions across 10 days. I'll give you a second to read this. Next slide. So once we hit here, and again, I've talked about measuring progress. I think we've all hit measuring progress at different points, because this isn't a now it's time to measure progress piece. This is as we're developing all of these pieces, as we're developing the present levels of performance, as we're writing our goals, measuring progress is always in our head. We're always going back to how are we going to measure students' progress over time. Slide. So this is where we're here. So we're going to think about what is meaningful progress and is the skill generalizing. Slide. We're back to methods of evaluation. Some things to think about, and this again could take quite a long time. But we want to think about how, if we're measuring progress, how are the tests created? We have some standardized assessments we use fairly frequently, especially in academics. We might be using curriculum-based measures, or we might have assessments that we're creating as teachers to reflect specific behaviors we're working on with students. We're also thinking about the scores themselves. So when we have student scores or students who are doing observational data, perhaps, we're looking at what are we referencing that to? Are we looking to see that student's performance is improving over their last performance? Is there a specific criteria? We've looked at all the kiddos in that classroom. We know how much they're participating in class, and we want our student to hover around that mark. So maybe there's a specific criteria we're referencing our students to, or we might be using normed assessments. And then students' response. Are students responding through written materials? Are we observing student behavior? Or are we looking at students' verbal responses? So think about what you have and review your expected behavior if you were working on the worksheet. Think about, is it a functional area? Your assessment, if it's a functional area, should include some sort of task analysis. And also, that task analysis might actually include level of prompting that you're using to be able to get students to perform skills independently. Is it an expected behavior that needs to be performed? Is that student performing it accurately? Have they performed it accurately in the past? Do we know that the student can perform that skill? Is that student performing it, but they're not performing it frequently enough? Are you having to reteach that skill over time? You taught it to them on Friday, things were going really well. You went back to work on Monday and it went somewhere else. So are you reteaching that skill? Or is the student only performing that skill with you? That's when those other teachers come up to you and say, they do that in your class, but they're not doing it in mine. Then we're going to think about generalization. How will you assess those? So if you're doing a task analysis, we often assess that just by number of skills completed. And did they complete those skills with or without prompts? If they're accurately performing it, we want to know what's the percent accurate? How accurately are they performing it? If it's fluency, we're really thinking about rate. How quickly and accurately can they perform that skill? And if it's maintenance, can they perform that skill over time? Did I teach it to them on Monday? I reassessed it the next week and the student still continued to perform that skill? Or did I need to reteach components of that skill as well? Or generalization. So you may be assessing fluency in brand new settings. You might be looking at fluency with different people. Or what's really important is that student adapting that skill in different places and settings when they need to adapt it. Slide. So again, we focused on Laura and we were looking at frequency of peer greetings. So that was our place for her. And we knew that she wasn't maintaining that skill in terms of greeting her peers, but that she could greet the adults. Slide. So think in the chat, type in the chat, what challenges have you encountered when ensuring that students should generalize behavior? So think about, are they generalizing it across settings within the school or outside of the school? Are they generalizing across people? So are they generalizing with teachers and peers, or are they not doing it with peers outside of school? Or are they adapting that skill into brand new contexts?
So Kate, we've got a couple people that have voted or responded saying that a measurable or observable behavior is really challenging. Identifying what that is, or generalization between home and school environment is not present and may not be supported by the caregivers. No systematic planning from initial onset of supports is provided. And more people are also, lots of people are commenting about the generalization between home and school environment being really tricky.
So, and I think those are really, those are real concerns. A couple of things when we start thinking about planning generalization on the onset. So part of this is having parental participation or family participation when we're talking about what skills we're selecting in the first place. We want to think about how we can embed what skills are important to families as well. And how much do we need there? Does that make sense? I wish I had you folks here to kind of talk about this. And Laura and Katie can chime in as well, because they know lots about generalization. But it's where you plan on the onset becomes really important to know how much participation and how do you know that the folks at home value the skills that you're trying to teach at school as well.
I would say I would just add one of the major skills when my son was in preschool, and I don't even know if he had an IEP goal on it, but the OT really wanted him to tie his shoes. And we have Velcro, right? He didn't handwrite. He was not toilet. He wasn't going on the toilet. There were some significant things that were stopping us from being able to participate in basically a lot of community stuff. Tying the shoes was not a big factor. So we spent a lot of time on learning how to tie shoes, which never generalized at home because I never did it. I didn't have time. And I just told him to get his Velcro on and we were out the door. So a question like that, if we had had a conversation up front about shoe tying, we would not have spent so much time doing a skill that I never was going to participate at home because I was so much more concerned with him playing with kids in the playground and being able to use the toilet. Those were my major skills at the time rather than shoe tying. So,
yeah, I also think in schools, we're not always communicating the prompts that we're using or the context that we're setting up to support the student in demonstrating those skills with parents and families. So we may have a great setup and, we've worked with the student a lot and they have become conditioned to the prompts and the situations that we provide at school. And so they perform the behavior at school. And again, if there isn't that opportunity or that system to support ongoing communication and feedback to families don't necessarily know, what those prompts are, whether it's visual or verbal, like the language that we're using to, to remind students to perform that skill. And so that becomes really critical too.
The other big piece that people are commenting on is non-classroom settings and consistency across the school being something that feels like they can have some fidelity of whatever the goals are, it being really challenging.
Yes. I think that's a really important thing. It's a really important concept, and it's very difficult to do, especially if you're working with folks who don't have the background of the student's IEP, or are not aware of what we're doing in classroom settings, or they're not comfortable implementing our interventions. What I think we should do, because we're running low on time, is I'm going to zip through the rest of this, and I want to go back to that question because it's really important. So Katie, could you swap slides? And then we've already done this. So we want to think about, again, Laura, we already talked about kind of the behaviors, what she was doing and how we would assess the skills with Laura. We could probably skip the slide and go to the next one. And then write IEP goals based on Laura. So we'll go to the next one. We're running out of time a little bit. And then the next one. And then the next one. Sorry. And then the next one, because we'll just go straight to her goals. So if we were thinking about Laura and we want to make these observable and measurable, our goal by the end of the year is that without prompts, that during arrival, because we focus on that small discrete skill, and in her IEP, we would probably focus on the other discrete skills as well, that she would verbally initiate a morning greeting, good morning, with a peer next to her in 4 out of 5 opportunities across 5 days. So if Laura does this for the most part for 4 out of the 5 opportunities during the week, Laura has mastered this goal by the end of the year. In the beginning, we're still focused on that same behavior, but with our objectives, if you're in a state that requires objectives like our state for all kiddos, we'll start with a higher level of prompts so that our conditions are really with teacher modeling, that she'll initiate morning greetings. And our measurement is about the same. We're going to track whether or not she said good morning across those 4 out of 5 opportunities in 5 days. But as we go along in our objectives, we'll start to lessen our modeling. We'll start working on verbal prompts, then we'll move to visual prompts, and then we'll remove prompts. Next slide. So in sum, we want to make sure our present levels of performance include our observable and measurable, that we're thinking about students and connecting this back into how can we help students make progress in the general ed settings, that we have measurable annual goals, that we know how we're going to measure and understand that child's progress towards those goals, when it will be measured, and that we're reporting that progress annually so that all the folks involved with our kiddo know if our student's making progress as well. Next slide. And this is our bonus section with Laura, who can talk about accommodations and modifications.
Okay, and we're going to do this pretty quickly because we really want to leave time for Q&A. So next slide. Why we wanted to talk about this is that this is something that on my son's IEP year after year, I started to count them, and we'd have like 30 or 40 accommodations and modifications, which gets really confusing when you're in junior high. And those are legally things that each teacher in each class is supposed to be providing accommodations and modifications. So I started having conversations with the IEP team on how can we actually have ones that meet what his individual needs are and that we actually can carry out throughout the day. So basically they're supposed to help support the individualized needs of the student, support the success and are outlined in the IEP. And often we find these are really kind of the core components if you have kids with 504 plans. Next slide. The major differences is accommodation helps kind of support, where a modification is more a change. We really want to try to have accommodations before we have modifications. Next slide. This is just a fail. This would have been an accommodation for somebody with a wheelchair. And as you can see, it's not very effective because it can't really get you anywhere. Next slide. So just a couple of examples. So if it's an assessment, Kate has difficulty taking notes in a classroom because she is easily distracted by peers. An accommodation that's matched to that is that Kate is given preferred seating in the front of the class versus all students with ADHD sit at the front of the class. And my fear is that sometimes we have those kind of like, here, let's take a kid that's similar who also has ADHD or autism and cut and paste from between IEPs. And again, we forget that individual component. So we just want you to be alerted to accommodations and modifications should also go back to the plop and to your IEP goals and make sure that they do support the individual needs of the student and they're not just a whole bunch of ones that you are, by the way, legally bound to be providing to every single student. Make sure you have a couple that the student knows, they learn how to use, and that they can be more effective. Next slide. And that was accommodations in 30 seconds.
Well done, Laura.
Thank you.
So we've got a few really great questions from our participants. One, I'm going to combine a couple of them. One is that how do we best utilize instructional coaches and BCBAs to support the development of IEPs and student goals? I'll throw that out to any one of you.
Yeah, I can take first stab, but feel free to jump in, Kate or Laura. I think, again, some of this goes back to the systems that you have in place in your school to provide support to special education teachers in identifying and developing IEP goals. So if there's an opportunity for a team collaborative approach in conducting the assessments, in collecting information from families and having those conversations, those ongoing conversations with families, and then in designing the goals, I think instructional assistants and BCBAs can provide really valuable information that helps identify some of those observable, measurable behaviors and define those observable and measurable behaviors that then can go into goals, as well as breaking down some of the larger skills into, smaller components that are teachable. So again, what that system looks like, if there's time for meetings or how that time, I feel like it's the timing that is always difficult in schools. Like, how do we find the time for these people to get together and meet and share ideas? And that's always the challenge.
To piggyback on what Katie just said, those systems are what helps us have the ability to generalize skills with students if we have time for meeting for teachers, and that we send messages, just to go back to answer that question that was asked before I couldn't, but that we let folks know what skills students are working on in the different settings. It's how you establish systems in the schools to support students with disabilities, for folks to have meetings and times to understand what are we doing with kids in different places.
One way I've seen this work well is if students are already receiving some supports either from a BCBA or from a specialist, to have some of that time be pushed in so that the intervention specialist is in the classroom with the teacher and has some time to collaborate and share information then.
Great, thank you. Another question that came through is, what does it look like for a teacher to keep track of all this data? And wondering if you guys have any helpful tips on ways to do that.
That is a great session. Question. We talked about originally having this as a workshop because there's so much to this topic that you just don't have time to get into. And the data collection piece is definitely one of those pieces that, we could spend more than 75 minutes talking about how to organize data. Let's see, I guess the short answer with the key points are, one, I would say identify the times or the context in which you want to collect data. And that's part of the goal, writing process, is in what context do you want to see this? So one, be really specific about the context, so you're not overwhelmed with trying to collect the data throughout the entire day, every day. I would say two, having some sort of an organization system, whether it's binders for each kid or, whatever that looks like that works for you, so that not just you, but any, paras or assistants in the room can also support with data collection. It should not only be the special education teacher that is collecting the data, but something that all people in the room are trained on and can support. So anyone can pick up that clipboard or that binder and record data for an individual student. And then I'd say three is having, again, that observable and measurable behavior really clearly defined.
It's impressive.
And the only thing I would have to add to that is that sometimes you can actually collect this data with really simple measurement systems. Sometimes we overcomplicate our behaviors. and that they're real simple systems that we can use to do it. And we just need so much more time to talk about this.
Yes, I agree. As a general ed teacher for a long time, it was always a real challenge when I would have students on IEPs and I needed to keep track of all their goals. The simpler, the better, and to really streamline what is it that you actually need to know, and make sure you're not collecting a lot of extra data that isn't necessary. All right, good. That brings us to 3 o'clock. So I know that there are a couple of additional questions that are in here, but we'll try to go back through chat and respond to them that way.
Thank you
Thanks,
all for
everybody.
joining.
Thank you.